Please start.
Namaskar, I'm Anisha Shekhar Mukherjee, and on behalf of the India International Centre, Delhi, I extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's attending this session of Talking Architecture, the second in our bi-monthly series of dialogues. I especially welcome Professor Snehanshu Mukherjee and Srinivas Murthy, our guests for today's session. Before I go on to introduce Snehanshu and Srinivas, I'd like to, for the benefit of those who were not with us in the first session held on the 11th of May, briefly explain the context and the background of the series and of today's talk. So in this series, we intend to raise fundamental questions about how we build, what we build, and most importantly, why we build. And we hope to find answers to these questions through public dialogue and discussion. Habitat is a domain that all of us are a part of, not just architects. And so this dialogue is open to everybody. In the first dialogue that we had on the discovery of architecture, we discovered how the role of the community permeated all aspects of building as part of a connected worldview in much of ancient wisdom and indigenous life. What also emerged is the pivotal role of modernism in institutional teaching and in mainstream practice and patronage of architecture today, which generally either completely ignores the voice of the community or reduces them to passive users, keeping them out of decisions about what to build, what to demolish, where to build, and the level of access and opportunities to people in making and using public and private space. Therefore, as a necessary first step in understanding how we can again take cognizance of people's needs and the involvement of the community in both envisioning and creating architecture, we need greater clarity on what modernism meant and what it means today, especially for us in India. Many people think of modernism as synonymous with modern and automatically attach meanings of progressive to modernism. Yet it has specific connotations in literature, in art, in music, theatre, and of course in architecture. And it has had global repercussions on human and other forms of life. So this is a focus of today's session, where Snehanshu will be presenting his thoughts on and his experience and analysis of the legacy of modernism, which also informs the book he's currently editing and working on. The talk will be followed by a discussion with Srinivas, after which we hope to include in the conversation questions from the audience. We have a total of an hour for all of this, so without more ado, I'll briefly introduce Snehanshu and Srinivas, and I'll encourage the audience to keep sending in their questions as the talk progresses. So Snehanshu Mukherjee has a degree in architecture from SPA Delhi and a postgraduate degree in design and housing from MIT Cambridge, USA. He is a founding partner of Team for Engineering, Architecture and Management, formed in 1986 after he, along with his friends A.R. Ramanathan and Anurag Gupta, won a national competition for the design of the new wing of the National Gallery of Modern Art. Since then, Team has chosen to be involved in the practice of architecture and design across different scales that range from institutional and public buildings, such as the new wing of the NGMA, the Embassy of Spain, the Osho Commune, and housing for leprosy patients, to master planning and township designs, to furniture and interior design for projects such as the multi-city Oxford bookstores, to international exhibitions and select residential projects such as the Shankardas House. Parallelly with architectural practice, Snehanshu has been active in research, writing, and teaching. He has taught and guided students at SPA Delhi and Vijayawada, the CEPT University Ahmedabad, KRVIA Mumbai, PVP College of Architecture, Pune, etc. At present, he is Adjunct Professor at the Indian Institute of Art and Design, architect at Delhi. Srinivas Murthy has a degree in architecture from SPA Delhi. He is the founder and principal architect of his studio practice, SMG Design Incorporated, formed in 1992. He has been involved in architectural design, research, documentation, and filmmaking. Under him, SMG Design Incorporated has undertaken many projects in museum design, medical and healthcare, tourism, corporate and IT infrastructure, and master planning of townships and academic campuses. He is the founder of Architecture and Design Foundation India, which actively works to communicate issues in architecture in the public domain. So we look forward to a rewarding session informed by Snehanshu and Srinivas's experience. And we now move on to Snehanshu's talk, The Legacy of Modernism. Thank you.
My first awareness of this thing called modernism was during my first year of architecture school, when I came across a book in the library which had photographs of a very unusual and dramatic house designed by the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. The house was appropriately called Falling Waters. The photographs in the book captivated me, and I remember coming back to the library many times over the year to look at them again and again. This led me to explore other architects who had created a radical new architecture, which I discovered was a movement called modernism. Being modern was suddenly revealed to me as an exciting path to the unconventional. In first year of college, the idea behind modernism made us believe that as architects, we had this tremendous opportunity that the world had never seen before. Be revolutionary in thought, and then make something that nobody had seen before. Then, as a fringe benefit, maybe become as famous as Wright himself. This then was the lure of modernism, and it was something that people outside of architecture college did not quite understand. Therefore, one felt superior as a misunderstood radical who had the good of the world at heart. A very popular book amongst many young architecture students was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. That too had a hand in getting the architecture students to feel in this way. I recounted my early experience as a student of architecture to try and explain the lure of modernism. By my second year, a class trip to Chandigarh to see Corbusier's architecture soon put an end to this elated sense of doing something new and meaningful. The large expanse of treeless, sun-baked, concrete-paved plaza between the Assembly and the High Court were not something that I could relate to. And on the other hand, Nek Chand's famous rock garden made from waste on the banks of the Sukhna lake was something that fascinated me. All of which led me to start questioning the validity of what we were being taught as modern architecture. In later years, I slowly realized that modernism was a form of indoctrination and is something that becomes a matter of faith. Therefore, despite my doubts, I tried following the path of modernism till recent years, when I began to analyze and understand a little better why I had instinctively doubted modernist architecture in my second year of undergraduate classes. Modernism is a term that was coined to describe a specific time period in mankind's inhabitation of this planet. It is an important period to look back at, since where we are today is in many ways a result of the continued actions of human beings that began during this time period. We also need to recognize the fact that we are still living with modernism, even though the original tenets of modernism have morphed over the years into many other isms to have reached what is now called the post-truth era. Human civilization, since ancient times, had evolved by the efforts of highly skilled and inventive people who created objects of daily use and grown food for their consumption in a geographically localized and sustainable manner, largely in harmony with nature. A break from the past happened some 250 years ago with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, which was brought about by the invention of machines that could take over, sorry, that could take over the work that was done by human hands. These machines were invented in the West to replace handcrafting, initially to substitute different products of daily use and to grow food necessary for living. In other words, the few simple tools or machines that man had invented in the pre-industrial times had been subservient to the human hand. Post-industrialization, man became a mere component of the machine, where the machine conditioned man to do its bidding. The European countries from the Northern Hemisphere before the Industrial Revolution were trading with the countries of the Southern Hemisphere, which were both resource-rich and technologically advanced in craft skills. Goods and materials produced in countries like China and India were sought after by wealthy Europeans. Trading companies such as the Dutch East India Company and later the East India Company were established as the first multinational corporations to meet this demand. The European traders competed with each other, often militarily, to secure the best trade routes and bring under their control the countries in the Southern Hemisphere, a period now known as colonialism. These merchants, through trading and financing from the time of the Renaissance, were the ones who provided the capital which powered the Industrial Revolution. Their newly gained wealth made them the new monarchs of the age of capitalism, eclipsing the traditional might of kings and the church. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, the flow of world trade reversed direction. The colonies now became chiefly the supplier of raw materials for the factories of Europe and also a captive market for machine-made products. As Eric Hobsbawm writes in his book, Industry and Empire, this vast and growing circulation of goods did not merely bring to Europe new needs and the stimulus to manufacture foreign imports at home. More than this, it provided a limitless horizon of sales and profit for merchant and manufacturer. And it was the British who, by their policy and force as much as their enterprise and inventive skill, captured these markets. In the early days of industrial production, the main purpose was to substitute local handcrafted products by factory-made ones. Soon, however, the race was on to invent completely new products, such as light bulbs, railways, or motor vehicles, along with machine guns, tanks, bombs, and fighter aircrafts, products that could not be imagined before that time. These and countless other things like the computer that I have talked this talk on are things that we take for granted these days. Factories with an assembly line of machines increased the speed of production to unimaginable limits and thereby produced a huge surplus of products, which then could be sold at much cheaper rates by a single manufacturer, who would therefore make higher profits than a number of traditional craftsmen who would produce the same number of goods over a longer period of time. For the buyer, prices of products were also kept artificially low by externalizing costs, which, according to business strategist and author Umar Haq, is economist speak for left for someone else to pay. He says externalizing costs meant that either someone else outside the market mechanism pays them, or no one pays them. In either case, the bill is adding up. Of those unpaid costs or of the toll, they are taking somewhere else in the system. As mentioned earlier, mass production was also meant that newer and bigger markets had to be found across the globe for the ever-increasing quantities of goods that the factories produced. As the writing of Friedrich Engels, among others, documents so vividly, mass production also created widespread unemployment and drove a majority of the rural population to poverty and consequently degraded their living conditions to horrific levels. This form of manufacturing was and still is essentially wasteful due to overexploitation of natural resources and the generation of abnormally high levels of waste, which in turn further damages the ecosystem and the environment we inherit. It is interesting to remind ourselves here that to produce a single bespoke piece of any product industrially is not feasible from an economic point of view. This is where the process of handcrafting, even today, is more practical, sustainable, and affordable, and always will remain the viable answer. The traditional crafts-based production method ensured that goods would not be produced by going beyond the limits of a sustainable level of consumption of natural resources. Modernism was the term coined to address this new state of being and to make the radically changed circumstances acceptable to the general public. To be modern was to go against tradition, to establish a brave new world completely different from the past. Newness was modernists' unique selling point. Peter Gay writes in his book, Modernism, the Lure of Heresy, and I quote here, the jaunty slogan that Ezra Pound, within brackets the poet, had introduced for his fellow rebels before the First World War was, make it new, tersely summed up the aspirations of more than one generation of modernists. In architecture, this newness was achieved by design, by adapting new materials and engineering technologies that emerged from the process of industrialization, which therefore allowed completely new forms of buildings to be built. The field of design became synonymous with the establishment of modernism. Accordingly, architectural education had to be modernized as well. In 1919, Walter Gropius and his colleagues in Germany established the first and most well-known school of design, the Bauhaus. It was here that artists and architects came together to address professionally the task of designing new products of the Industrial Revolution. The way of teaching developed at the Bauhaus has continued to influence the teaching method in design and architecture schools till today. Avant-garde architects and designers stated credos such as form follows function and less is more. Designs were to be expressed with complete honesty to reflect in their appearance the materials and construction processes that created them. Doors, windows, fireplaces, kettles, lamps, and furniture, traditional products used within the house, were redesigned anew to suit the production process of a machine. Buildings were to be honest, and stylistically not pretend to be Greek or Roman temples. Instead, they needed to express the true nature of the new technology behind their construction and structure. The house and the city were to be efficient and to function as perfectly as a machine. While these stated principles were adhered to by some at the beginning of modernism, the emphasis was more to create a new form and appearance. Those engaged in creative fields, that is, authors, artists, dancers, musicians, fashion, product designers, and architects, looked for their inspiration towards the cutting-edge discoveries in science and the astonishing new inventions that was rapidly changing the physical world that they inhabited. Later on, as technology became more omnipresent and more than capable of achieving what had seemed to be impossible, like landing a space mission on Moon, modernist design tried to reflect the spirit of the times through superficial style. Cars were made to look like space rockets. Opera houses resembled sails of a ship, or an airport terminal looked as if it was trying to fly off. And often the designers did not even perform the designs did not even perform their primary tasks satisfactorily. A famous designer's juicer has become an iconic example of something that costs a lot, but does not work too well, and remains a conversation piece for those who recognize it as a designer product. With machines, the manufacturing of products no longer needed to be rooted within their geographical or cultural context. Pretty much anything the industrial age produced could be manufactured anywhere in the world. Today, we see the situation having achieved its final goal. We no longer choose products according to their country or place of origin. US, German, or British products are no longer made in these countries, since everything is now made in China. Many of the products are now no longer even designed in these countries, since designing too has been outsourced to talent pools located all over the world. Across the world, people living in urbanized areas now use similar products every day, live in houses or work in offices that could be anywhere. You could be in Houston or Dubai or Shanghai or Gurgaon and couldn't tell the difference in the superficial physicality of these places as long as you remained within mechanically conditioned indoors. Modernism, the other side of the coin of industrial production and globalization, irrespective of the vast differences in geography and culture, has finally achieved its goal to create a basic sameness across a flattened globe. Therefore, today, to preserve the value of those unique products that socio-cultural processes have evolved over time, we have to apply for global patent laws to establish geographical indication tags to prove that they belong to that place, and copies of such products made in China are not equivalent to the originals. Capitalism or free market trading has deliberately brought about a planned disconnect with traditional ways of making, where the maker, either the craftsperson or the farmer, was the repository of shared knowledge and also the propagator of that knowledge. Knowledge, as we understand it today, can exist separately from the maker, which then creates a situation where knowledge can exist without the maker. As discussed earlier, in the early periods of machine manufacturing, the human being was a small but essential part of aiding the machines to make products. However, since its inception, the purpose of machine technology has been to eliminate altogether human involvement in making or manufacturing. Today, this plan has been almost fully achieved with the invention of artificial intelligence and robotic manufacturing. This then is the planned disconnect between knowledge and making, as Douglas Rushkoff writes in his book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. And he says, instead of rethinking the innovations of the industrial age, we extended them into that second machine age envisioned by MIT economists. Rather than transcending industrialism's anti-human values, we digitized them. And you can see this very interesting table that Rushkoff puts together, comparing the early days, pre-industrialization that is, which he calls artisanal, industrial, and digital industrialism. And you can see the direction. So the artisanal is steady as a dot, industrial goes higher, and digital industrialism is exponential growth. Companies too change from family business to platform monopolies like Amazon and Uber, who don't actually make anything. They just sell in a manner where it outdoes the other manufacturers and actual makers. Currency, as you can see, is market money, central currency, and derivative instruments. Investment is direct investment, stock markets, and algorithms. Production, handmade, and he's given an example like manuscript, mass-produced is a printed book, and replicable is a file. Marketing, human face, branded icon, big data prediction. Communication is personal, mass media, and apps, and so on it goes. So scale is local, national, global, and it's optimized for, this is the most interesting, creation of value in the case of artisanal, extraction of value in the case of industrial, and destruction of value in the case of digital industrialism. So the modern architect is himself or herself a product of the strategy of disconnecting knowledge from making, a situation that began at the time of the European Renaissance. Industrialization further established the role of the modern architect as it is understood today. Modern architects acquired new knowledge to become practitioners of industrial technology. This is the drawing, part of the drawing which went on to make the Crystal Palace that you saw a little while ago, just before this slide. In the process, traditional architects were reduced to the role of construction workers. Whatever knowledge the traditional master craftsmen held was not considered worth knowing. What were initially valued were their hand skills. These skills, too, over time, have become no longer relevant as more and more machines take over the actual work of construction. Mainstream architecture, therefore, is moving closer towards eliminating the maker by adopting fully mechanized construction. The recent advent of 3D printing technology is an example of the way the future could unfold. Even an ancient handmade technique of building homes in Adobe is now being digitally printed in the West and given an iconic twist to make them appear new. The case of 3D printing shows the extremes to which industrial technology can push the final disconnect between making and knowledge, especially in the case of architecture, where handmaking has been its core strength till recent times. With the deployment of AI and 3D printing, the bulk of the knowledge remains with the software programmers and hardware manufacturers. Therefore, even the architect's role can now be eliminated. Here we should remember that a majority of the buildings constructed anywhere in the world are usually of a smaller scale. Of these, most are houses, the very domain that the 3D printing method is now trying to enter. To take away the human hand from their construction is meaningless, especially since engaging craftspersons to construct such building also helps build a robust local economy. But that goes against the very principle of capitalism and industrial production. Architecture is a large part of human production anywhere in the world, and therefore its impact on the environment is also huge. The unsustainability of industrial products and means of production, especially in the field of architecture, therefore, has a special significance. Production by skilled craftsperson, as has been discussed by many thinkers, scholars, and researchers over many years, is the only known viable option to achieve sustainability in construction and in long-term maintenance of buildings. Traditional knowledge of architecture, which lies unvalued with our craftspersons, is an existing knowledge base to create sustainable architecture, to which the newer technological advances need to be compared and then included as adaptations only after thoughtful evaluation. As modern architects, there are very few of us who actually build or construct with our hands. For us, there still exists a segregation between theory and practice. Ironically, the hands-on aspect of practice is something we acquire only a theoretical knowledge of. This is, of course, in college. The need of the hour is that we stop relying on second-hand ways of construction and be physically involved with projects at site. To construct our habitat sustainably, the act of building should be local, ethical, and wise about the way we use resources, both natural and human. These are not new ideas, but have been debated since the advent of industrialization. To achieve the above, we must also remember that the larger interests would like to control our lives through money power and would be against such a move towards Swaraj or localization and becoming self-reliant. To subvert the agenda of big money, it is time that we redefined architectural education. In recent years, one has witnessed an increasing number of younger architects who have unlearned their conventional architectural education to build following an alternative, traditional, craft-oriented way of design and construction. We need to empower more and more younger aspirants in the field of architecture in a manner where they are themselves capable of constructing what they design, to be able to practice in partnership and in collaboration with craftspersons and the client. Therefore, architectural education needs to become an amalgamation of theory with direct hands-on practice. I have now reached almost the end of my talk. While there is no doubt that there have been some amazing achievements that the Industrial Revolution has brought about, I have tried to show that there has also been a flip side, something that is now being experienced and understood. The single most detrimental effect of industrialization that has affected the planet as a whole is climate change. We are still in denial despite the scientific proof that has been put in front of us. Maybe the pre-industrial state was better. We will never know. But what we do know is that there is no going back. The lockdown last year showed us how a few months of industrial inactivity was enough to bring nature back to our cities, how the birds and animals came back, and how snow-capped mountain ranges, once invisible from a city like Jalandhar, were once again visible. But we are back to business as usual. The power of big business has not let the world take stock of the reality. Marx and Engels wrote their manifesto, Alternative to Capitalism, as far back as 1848. However, communism showed that it had its own inherent drawback, which is still visible in China today, that of a central authoritarian control that gives no space for redressal of wrongs. As this recent article by Anand P. Krishnan in The Hindu shows, the steady erosion of industrial citizenship, the growing peripheralization of workers, is not an isolated phenomenon with regard to China. Coincided with the global neoliberal turn since the 1980s that drastically changed employment relations across the world. The diminished status of workers is a grim reality, and despite President Xi Jinping's increasing reiteration of ideology, it is rooted in status quoism, shorn of any emancipatory promise or politics for the working class. These are things we need to remember as designers who have the power to change the world for the better or the worse. In 1973, the historian Arnold Toynbee had written this in his book, Mankind and Mother Earth. Will mankind murder Mother Earth, or will he redeem her? He could murder her by misusing his increasing technological potency. Alternatively, he could redeem her by overcoming the suicidal, aggressive greed that in all living creatures, including man himself, has been the price of the great mother's gift of life. This is the enigmatic question which now confronts man. I would like to end now with a last quote about what being modern means. This is from a well-known work of fiction by Evelyn Waugh, Brideshead Revisited, published in 1945, where one of the principal characters, Julia, talks about her relationship with her husband. And she says, "You know, Father Mowbray hit on the truth about Rex at once, and it took me a year of marriage to see. He simply wasn't all there. He wasn't a complete human being at all. He was a tiny bit of one, unnaturally developed, something in a bottle, an organ kept alive in a laboratory. I thought he was some sort of primitive savage, but he was something absolutely modern and up to date that only this ghastly age could produce. A tiny bit of a man pretending he was whole." Thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you. Thank you, Snehanshu, for a very comprehensive overview of the complexities and contradictions inherent in the very premise and founding of modernism and in its subsequent development in different parts of the world and in different domains of human activity. And of course, you ended with something which seems to show that being called modern is not a compliment at all. It's like an insult in the quotation that you read out from Brideshead Revisited. What I think came out very clearly from your presentation was the liaison between modernism, mechanization, and the mega market. And this has been commented on earlier. So Peter Gay, for instance, has written that when modernism took wing, mechanization took command. But I think perhaps it's not been emphasized enough for many of us to comprehend that if not hand in glove, then all these are certainly hand in hand. And together they encircle and limit us to a point where we feel that we'll all fall down, if we don't have them as props. And so we take these, we've been sort of brainwashed into accepting these as inevitable, so much so that modernism, which began as a rebellion against convention, has become the conventional response now. And there are directions which can help us overcome this, and you've pointed some of these out. And thank you for that. And that's the point where I'd like to invite Srinivas in to ask him to pick out the strands from Snehanshu's presentation that he feels require more discussion and clarification. And I'd also request everybody who's attending this to please send in your comments as well, so that we can incorporate them in the conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. Snehanshu, good to listen to you again. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank IST for organizing this series of talks, and discussing some very important and relevant topics of the time. So, Snehanshu, as usual, you have again given us a very thought-provoking presentation, which definitely creates, a lot of conflicting ideas. Sometimes we agree with you, sometimes we don't agree with you, and I have my own set of thoughts, and I would like to discuss that with you. And I'm sure before even we could conclude, there will be a lot of other audience questions that would come up. To begin with, I would like to understand from you is that when you say that this whole idea of modernism basically was trying to establish a brave new world that which was completely different from the past. That's the phrase that you use. So does it kind of, in sense, give us an idea that there was a deliberate agenda behind this modernism, which would lead to a certain, what we today call a capitalism or an industrialized world? Or was it not actually meant to be a very unique, creative, innovation process by which we would be creating something new, which was what modernism was supposed to be doing? But what you hint us is that no, there was also something beyond that, which has resulted in, if I can use the word, called the problem that we have got into today. So do you agree with that, that there was an agenda more than just creating a new process of thinking, creativity, or innovation?
So, yes, thank you, Srinivas, for this question. And again, I should also thank the Indian International Center and Anisha for organizing this opportunity, first of all. But yes, what you're saying, see, you yourself said, and so has very many others, that it's a far more complex situation than what I make it out to be. But for the purposes of, you know, coming to a simpler understanding, one needs to get out of the complexity to see where we are today. Now, I think at the time of, it's not as if it was a deliberate act to go hand in hand with capitalism or colonialism that was still going on at that time. Uh, the people who embraced modernism, largely from the creative sides, like the architects and the artists, did so because they found it so exciting. And that's why I talk about the book, The Fountainhead, where the story is really the tussle between the conventional architect who is using the modern technology but disguising it as classical building, as opposed to the struggling architect who is trying to go with the brave new world that modernists promise, or not modernists, I would say the technologists promise. And yes, they did promise and they did deliver. I wouldn't say that they didn't. I mean, you couldn't have probably done an open heart surgery in the early days of industrialization, which you can do today. A lot of, and that's what I say as well, there are a lot of very good things have also happened. But I think the problem that has come in is the market driven one. We didn't know when to stop. We don't know when to stop because and we kind of buy into it. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, partially, I think some of your last few words got a little muffled up in the, internet era.
Oh, sorry.
But yes, I would like to
Sorry.
probably, take it further to understand that. So industrialization, as we all believe, that also was trying to establish as is a very socialist idea of equality, where everybody would get access to certain kinds of products which were otherwise, if you look at it from a very traditional perspective, where there was craft involved, there was certain kind of hierarchy involved, and only few could have something which were very well crafted and few could have, but nonetheless everybody had an opportunity and access to certain kinds of products. But industrialization probably was an idea where you thought of equality from a social perspective, whereas capitalism was trying to get in that uniformity, or that whole authoritarian approach to that, who would be the provider and who would be the seeker. In that context, I think somewhere even in architecture, when we talk about, from when you talk about the master craftsman versus to the architect of the day, I think somewhere the master craftsman became a master craftsman because he was a craftsman to begin with. Probably in the initial years of his practice, he actually built the buildings himself, or he practiced that craft himself, and by virtue of his experience, he gradually becomes a master craftsman and starts advising, designing, or giving instructions to his subordinates. Whereas I think the modern architect today is a product of a system where he's been told on the day one of joining the course that you are going to start giving instructions and guidance to somebody, and you might not have built by yourself. And I think modernism, in that sense, the greatest impact it has had, at least on architecture, in my opinion, is creating that divide between the creator or the thinker versus the doer, who is the so-called labor or the mason or the electrician or the technician at site. And in that sense, I think, so the way you mentioned about the plant disconnect, I looked at the disconnect in this way, that this is where you are disconnecting the architect actually from the process of construction or building the building by himself. So I would like to ask you, in the context of this particular concept of plant disconnect, don't you think that architects today are also connected in a different way, if not directly through the means of craft, but probably they are connected through to the society by their virtue of their knowledge or expertise of planning, let's say housing for them, so that more and more people are able to get housing? Maybe, of course, I understand your perspective would be from the technology that we would use to make houses, but at least in terms of planning better with the resources, of to look at in many other aspects which sometimes craftsmen may tend to ignore or lose. So do you agree with this kind of a positioning of an architect and connection with the society today?
Not entirely, Srinivas, because as we as architects all know that society as a whole, when you go for any projects which are not large scale, if you're talking about a small scale project, the client, who is always very suspicious of you till you have worked for them and established the faith, would rather listen to the contractor, you know, on the site, and very often would not would be verifying what the architect is saying with the contractor or even the mason or the electrician or whatever. You see, that's because they don't see the architect as being directly connected with the construction itself. The architect is like a person who, provides all the drawings. And these days, of course, the lot of architects don't even want to go to site anymore, which was not the case earlier. But so there is that disconnect between architects and society. In fact, I remember when I joined architecture college years ago, a lot of people didn't understand what I was studying, and I'm talking about common people. So there, I don't know if architects have still made that difference. Yes, now it's a term that's well known, and a lot of students join architecture colleges, and there are so many new architecture colleges. But the fact remains that maybe we are not that well connected with society, unlike, let's say, a doctor or a lawyer, you know. But the other thing is that, you see, you said something about the relevance of architects in doing, let's say, building housing which helps people get to the house that they deserve to live in. But you see, this is where the interference of the capitalist mode gets in, because if you see, in recent times, especially ever since we've gone into new liberalization, where the housing is again being controlled by money. Today, if you want to buy yourself a plot in most of the big cities, that's not going to work. You're not going to be able to afford it. At least in the NCR, you can't, and definitely not in Mumbai. So what are you going to do? You're going to stay in high-rise buildings which are made with a certain kind of technology, which comes with its own inherent problems, and where again the worker can be eliminated, and that is how you try to make it less expensive and then increase your profit. So it gets more and more complex. So I think the important thing to understand is that who controls the technology is what makes all the difference. If we let big money control technology, and that's where the Rushkoff table is very interesting to look at, then we lose out. So I am not against technology per se. I am against the fact that we don't really control it as people, as human beings. We are not in a position, because any case technology largely is very complex these days, whether it is digital or analog, and it's not as simple as repairing a bicycle anymore. So there are, I mean, this is a very complex issue. So it's a little difficult to talk about this in a short time. But I guess you understand that, Srinivas.
That's very interesting what you say. So I'm just trying to understand. So if you, in my opinion, modernism also has its own, various phases.
Sorry, Anisha is
Very
trying to
quickly
say
to
something. Srinivas, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Anisha is trying to say
I just
something.
wanted to briefly add to what both of you were saying regarding the role of the architect and what we can do in terms of architectural practice and teaching today. So this is related to an incident when somebody was driving us to, there was this international conference on architectural history, and the driver asked me what I do, and I said I'm an architect, and he said, "Acha, aap naksha banate, you make drawings." So I think in in the general mind of everybody, that is all that architects do. They make drawings. The buildings are made by somebody else, and I think that is what is the disconnect in both the perception and the practice of architecture today. And therefore, related to that, I have a question that I'd like to ask, which is that given the fact that we can't go back, and given the fact that we have this technology with us, what how do we proceed? And this is also related to a question that Varni sent in from Delhi, which is where she's asking, how do you envision the future of architecture? Will it be like a sci-fi sort of city, or will it be more sustainable? And how do we move forward?
So just to answer that, I hope it's not going to be sci-fi. Though we can see that the billionaires are trying to populate planets these days. That's their ultimate goal, whether it's Elon Musk or whoever else. But that's like, that's like accepting that the industrialization, the process of industrialization in capitalism is going to ruin this planet completely, that it will not be livable anymore. And we have no choice but to go settle down in Mars. I think that's a completely ridiculous way of approaching the problem. That's why I said that during the lockdown, which was just about 2 or 3 months, with inactivity, things started coming back to a more balanced situation. And the moment, and of course, climate change is happening, but I think it can be reversed. You can read about it almost every day in the newspapers. That's one. Now, regarding the role of the architect, I think it's not as if technology is to be abandoned, but we have to think about what is really needed. A lot of things can be done by hand. And as I said, that to make a single industrial product through a process of industrialization, which is factories, mechanization, energy, huge energy requirements, and waste of materials, is completely not feasible in terms of money. Whereas a similar product by hand is very much feasible. So if we look at what we really need every day for living, very few of those things are really required to be built in the industrial way at all. We need definitely to look at what we are doing, and that is imperative because we know where we are headed if we don't. So I think this is something, that's why I say that we are in denial most of the time. So Srinu has, yeah,
Yeah,
please.
but so Snehanshu, I have a very interesting point here to make, that the way you said that things can be still done by hand, but at the same time, when we look at, I think what modernism has done. Of course, we have been discussing about modernism mostly we want to discuss in the context of architecture, but obviously architecture cannot be discussed in isolation. It has to be discussed in the overall context. But look at the way our social values and ethics and cultural values have changed over the years. And I would always like to believe that the modernism itself had, I would broadly like to divide it into three phases, which is the early modernism, or let's say the mid-century modernism. And interestingly, a couple of weeks back, there was discussion on whether the mid-century modernist architecture of the country should be preserved because they themselves are now being looked at as, of heritage value. But at the
Yeah.
same time, if you look at the mid-century versus the end of the century kind of a scenario, so mid-century probably the change in the trend or change in the social values, change in cultural and aesthetical values took probably a decade or let's say 2 decades to be seen virtually. Whereas in the end of the century, the change was literally seen on a yearly basis, if I can use that word.
Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
look at the 21st century modernism, which is times of today's, I mean, I think the change is instant. It's almost like an
Yeah.
hourly basis.
Yeah.
So what was
Yeah.
good an hour ago is no more relevant now.
Yeah.
So in
Yeah.
this space of this whole development or the change, what I'm looking at modernism is also causing some kind of a damage to our intellectual and creative and aesthetical sensitivities. And in that
Absolutely right.
sense, so in that sense, I would like to look at that. If you look at in early late 70s, early 80s, I would say up to almost mid 80s also, a house and a car was almost a retirement plan for a middle income group family where the person would look after the family well, kids get married off, and then he's retired, so he gets. But today, owning a flat or a car is the symbol of your success. I mean,
Yes.
many social scientists have talked about it. That so in this context, what has happened is that I think if you look at a young architect wanting to practice craft based, let's say, design or wanting to get involved in a hands on experience of practicing architecture, he's challenged by his peers who are moving in other sectors on a much faster pace. So I think somewhere society also needs to be encouraged or inspired or maybe to think about this and maybe make changes at the primary education level, that how certain materialistic objectives need not be the benchmark of success versus the intellectual or academic pursuit. So what would you like to say this dilemma a young architect is going through today?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, Srinivas. And you're right, because I remember when we graduated, it wasn't about making a lot of money, but, really about learning how to build and build well. Whereas today, very rightly so, because society has created this situation where money is the measure of how good you are. Now, it's a very difficult thing because till society is going to make that shift back to a value system which is not monetary. And here again, I feel that it's again, as I keep saying, it's a very complex affair because it's like also what the government pushes. So if you see, before the liberalization period of Narasimha Rao, we were socialistic, and therefore the kind of architecture that came up was, I would say, more egalitarian. But ever since that time period, architecture has also moved towards, flashiness, glamour, iconic, and it's more like advertising now rather than having any real values. And this is a product of the economic mode that we have adapted. And naturally, society also had to, keep up with that kind of a shift. It's a drastic shift. And it's today. So initially, you didn't get to see too much the effect because we were transiting. But today, it's all around us. And those of us like you, Anisha, or me, and I'm sure others in this audience, have actually lived through those periods. Not the younger generation who've been born into this can see that difference. How do we make that change? As you say, maybe primary school education, value systems. It's very difficult to say how it should be done, but in architecture, I can say that there are very heartening signs of young architects who could have and have been employed in big building organizations making a move very similar to people in multinational companies chucking it all and growing organic agriculture. A very similar kind of a situation has started happening with architects as well. So, Anisha is on a Facebook group of people who have deliberately started practicing using natural materials and traditional techniques, and they seem to be happy doing that. And I'm hoping that more and more students do that, or more and more young architects do that. And this is where architecture schools have a role to play. We have to stop just teaching them to become some kind of, iconic designers and look at this aspect. I think
So,
Anisha wants to say
Snehanshu, I
something.
mean,
Yeah.
related to what both of you have said, and also another question that's come in. Yes, primary education should do all of this. And yes, there are young architects who are sort of going against the norm and experimenting on their own, but they're doing it despite of rather than because of architectural training and instruction and
Yes.
the rest of it. So, how do we actually do this in practical terms with your experience in teaching? What would you say we should be doing? And this is also a question that's come in from Roshni from Sonipat, which is that how can we unlearn the modernistic tendencies of architecture in order to alter the discourse of contemporary architecture in the subcontinent? So, what can we do at the level of architectural colleges? Because people
I
spend a
think,
lot of
yeah.
time unlearning things.
Yes. So I think you are absolutely right. And Roshni, this is a very valid question, and the answer is very simple. I'll give it through my own example. When I was a student of architecture in SP at Delhi, in our fourth year, Ashok Lal, who has been our teacher at that time, created a project where we were supposed to do rehabilitation for the slum displaced people. And that was the only time we got to actually work with a people centric project, which was a thing that was very much needed. We never did anything after that, but that made a big impression on all of us, I think. Now, architecture colleges can very well do this. They can, I'm not saying that you don't teach the way you're teaching right now, but the projects are the vehicles through which new knowledge about other ways of constructing, other ways of designing can be imparted. And that's very, very important. It's like, I'll say another thing, which I'm sure all the architects in this group will follow. The moment you start a design, you presuppose that it's going to be in reinforced cement concrete. You never think of any other kind of construction material, even if you're doing a house. Naturally, if you're going to do a large span structure, you'll have to work with steel or RCC to some extent. But we never tell our students that, you know, look at the project. What is the cost involved? Who is the client that you're building for? Is it really required to use all these high energy intensive, expensive materials when you could have built it out of local stuff? And we don't really expose them to local crafts and systems. So I think the schools of architecture have a major role to play, and after the student finishes, then it's their choice which way they want to go. So
But
this is
I
the
would like
approach.
to
Yeah.
add, Stanshu, to that, I won't say that we should leave it to them what to do, because they need to get equal opportunities also to perform what they would
Yeah.
actually like to
Yeah.
do. And that is where I think the challenge also comes, because in my opinion, again, what modernism has done, not just in architecture but in general, is that it has eliminated that whole concept of individual identity with very specific, unique characteristics, which was supposed to be the strength of a human being or a person who was living. What I think industrialization and modernization has done is that it has not only centralized the whole concept of making and supply, and the what I
Hmm.
call is the provider versus the seeker, and also what it has done, it is also developed this, promoted this concept of consolidation, because the numbers in an industrialized world is very important. So you
Yes.
cannot look at one craftsman as a market for yourself. You have to have enough number of people whom your housing product can be sold, whom the door frame which should look uniform across thousand flats or houses that you design should be same. So customization actually became more of a, I would say, poshness, or about again a notch higher in their the way they promoted it, so that they said that our products are more about equality, more about reaching out,
Hmm.
more making
Hmm.
it affordable. And in that context, what is happening today, even today, a client who is investing money and wanting to make a building, and who ultimately wants to hire an architect, himself is not probably aware or even interested in trying to experiment with this individualistic a person who has different talent, which is different from the industrial production process. I think that is where intervention needs also to be made, that how do
Yes.
we tell people in the value of having a customized house. I mean, I was hoping that, okay, if industrialization and modernism has got this multi-storied housing block which solves the housing problem, which unfortunately since my college days till now we have been always listening to the same number of deficit even today.
Yeah.
But I was actually hoping that some of these individual houses which would get built would actually be in many ways customized and where individual craft oriented talent would be enforced. But today, even concept of gated communities where all villas have to look the same, because the whole beauty lies in that kind of an architectural, grammar. I think somewhere the focus should definitely go on to uh, resensitizing people about the value of this individual characteristic, both as a person, as a client, as an architect, as a craftsman. That how these can be molded to suit your own personal needs, and rather than come from a factory. So that's something which I feel, I don't know. The task to me looks like it's gigantic, because one side you
Yes.
have this huge big industrialist production process and the lobby, and here is one simple architect who wants to convince the client that, okay, I will give you a well crafted house.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's the battle I think all of us have to really get
Are
on.
facing. So you see, that's where I say it's a planned disconnect. You see, and that's why I tried to show that very soon architects are also going to become redundant because of artificial intelligence and robotics. So we have to recognize these threats as real threats and not think of them as science fiction. And you know that it's not going to happen. It's like climate change was not going to happen. It was one bakwas scenario by a bunch of idiotic scientists, but it is happening, right? China, the slide I showed shows China's floods after 1,000 years. It's not a few hundred years, it's 1,000 years according to the Chinese. So, you know, the point is that the industrialized products and systems are now dominating our choices in a manner where you push out hand altogether. Otherwise, you think about, I mean, this is a debate we've had so many times with people, where, with friends, where we say that, you know, look at the objects in your house. Almost everything is actually industrially produced. If you're not buying organic agricultural products, then that also is somewhat industrially produced because there's fertilizers and insecticides all feeding into it. Whereas these are, I mean, I would think, I mean, this is a rough guess, at least 80 to 90% of those things can actually be craft made. And that would keep the economy local. It would keep it not going to overseas or to big companies within the country. You know, that is something that we can do as architects. But now the situation is so difficult. To make a handcrafted house is probably more difficult than to make a machine made house. That is where we've reached because of the planned
I'd like
disconnect that the
to
industrialization has done.
ask you something, Snehanshu Srinivas, which is related to the current. I mean, it adds to the debate, and perhaps you've partially answered this. But Biresh has written in from Kathmandu to say that the modernism of the past and the rampant technological divide today, he thinks they're two different things, and we can't go back to the past, which is what you also said, Snehanshu. So he's saying that architects should be more inventive in trying to figure out what to do, and the range of their intervention, I suppose, will depend on where they are and what choices they have. But if you'd like to answer that. And Anirudh Shankardas has written in to ask, again related to this question of individuality, etc. He's asked if modernism, you think it dilutes local culture, or by instituting a sort of uniformity, it actually removes borders and differences. And I've encountered this again in a class that I taught in SPA, where one of my students, where I was encouraging students to actually also research and access sources in their languages, and they said, well, English is what we've been told is best for us, because we can all communicate in English, otherwise we all have a different languages that does not enable communication. And though that has a certain logic, but if you sort of throw out local culture and local languages, then of course it would mean a much of a muchness. So to add to, therefore, to the conversation that both of you were having, would you like to answer this further?
Well, first to answer Biresh's point is that yes, that's also what we are trying to say, that every architect has to think for themselves. But I think what is more important is to be aware of the situation you are in, first of all. Most of us go through life in a kind of a blindfolded manner. Very rarely do we stop to question what is happening around us and what we are doing. I think that's the first thing. And then you may find your own answers to how to deal with it. What I have understood is that to go with crafts, however difficult it may be, it also depends on your opportunity as far as the client is concerned, because very few of us have the money to build for ourselves.
So you are stuck with a client who is going to fund you. But if we can convince the client, it can be done. There are many examples, and I'm not talking about large scale projects, I'm talking about the smaller scale of projects. That's where the intervention makes it useful and meaningful, whether it's a small nursing home or a school or a house or whatever. I mean, there are enough, and that's the bulk of the buildings. So yes, for that I would say this. And but for Anirudh's comment, I would say that yes, that's why I said that you don't know whether you're in Houston or Shanghai or Gurgaon, but the because of the way the sameness is been established. But then we have lost a lot in terms of culture, the values that we had. And for me, for instance, I seem to have, moved from a time when it was more strong cultural values, because I remember spending all my summer and winter holidays in school in a joint family house in Calcutta, which was my mother's ancestral home, where the whole house was like a whole neighborhood, really, because there were hundreds of people staying there, and it was wonderful. And there were many things that one learned. We did not speak English, of course, and we only spoke in Bengali. But the point is that I'm trying to make is that that is something that is missing from, let's say, my daughter's life today, whether she stays here or goes to Calcutta. In fact, these days, because of the way modern life is, we end up staying in a hotel, even if if we have to visit relatives, because we can't burden them by landing up on their heads and expect them to manage somehow. So I think it's very important to hold on to our cultural strengths, and that is what gives us our identity. Otherwise, we'll all be applying for geological identification tags. That we we are individuals staying in different parts of this world.
Yeah.
So that's what I have to say. I'm being a little flippant,
But
but
Snehanshu, that's a very
certain.
interesting. Snehanshu, you have really brought out a very interesting point of visiting your cousins or family in other cities and how they feel burdened. I think this is what I was also hinting at, that the
Yeah.
21st century modernism has brought so much pressure on us that we have somehow decided willingly or at a subconscious level, I don't know, but to ignore some of these core value systems. Okay, and
Yes.
I would like
Yes.
to also address the same issue in a slightly different way. And look at, let's say, Fab India is a good example where they have gone ahead and
Hmm.
adopted and promoted and patronized so many of weavers across the country and developed a very successful business model where
Yes.
the benefits are somewhat also reaching back to the people who are dealing with the craft. And also look at the tradition. What I always get surprised is that architecture is considered to be a new profession in that sense in India.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I'm a great propagator of this thought that in India, architecture should never be treated as a profession. It should be treated as a craft. And the moment you
Yes.
look at the craft versus profession debate, naturally the humanness comes into picture. But I
Yes.
would like to understand is that if architectural profession is new in this country, then what about fashion design, which is in fact much newer in that sense of practice? But look at the way fashion design, or I would say, including performing arts today in India, have
Hmm.
adopted this modernism in a very nice, subtle, and graceful manner by they sticking to certain base, cultural values and traditions and customs, and including certain grammar from the
Yes.
design principles or aesthetic principles, and still create modern contemporary creations, both in fashion as well as in performing arts. Why is it that in architecture we are not able to do that? And I think this is where, to me, the biggest question arises is that, first of all, how do I equip myself with the kind of skill sets which makes me an expert to use the traditional wisdom of crafts and architecture in a contemporary manner in India? That is number one. And I think this is where I feel the architectural education is really, I mean, there's too much to expect out of it for the
Hmm.
time being, I feel. So that is one
Hmm.
thing. And second thing is that this whole idea of, even if I look at it from a very commercial perspective, let's say tourism industry, which is supposed to be one of the highest revenue earning industry of modern times. I mean, we would like to travel to, let's say, Egypt to see what their architecture is all about. We would like to visit China. We would like to visit Europe because they are different. But what if 50 years, 100 years from now, if all of them start looking the same, which is
Hmm.
happening anyway today,
Yes.
then you don't want to visit. So, do we realize that it is going to also have long-term economic impact, and maybe a negative one where people would not like to visit anymore. And also the whole idea, I think somewhere which to me even now I'm pretty confused, is that what is my homeland, what is my home state, what is my hometown? I think the question came, somebody asked that is it dividing or is it unifying, in terms of people, in terms of societies. But I would like to believe that all these centuries we have lived together so happily with our cultural diversity. Then why is this question of divide coming in now? I don't think we should be talking about divide. I think it is more a question of continuity, more a question of feeling pride, taking pride in what belongs to us, what is our own, which is not really borrowed. I think the whole aspect should be that can we develop certain kind of a system which is forward from here now onwards? That how do I take my tradition, my customs, my craft, my rituals in a contemporary manner without devaluing either their craft value or their importance in our social or cultural existence. So that is how I look at it, and I really wish that we could do something about it in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point.
That's a fascinating conversation, Srinivas, and you brought up a strand which I think Snehanshu also spoke about, which is essentially about knowledge systems and a worldview and how craft sort of encapsulates all that. And I think that's perhaps what we all have to re-examine, both in terms of it's not necessarily being looked at as old or irrelevant, but how can we get it back into relevance in terms of involvement of the human being, and craft is a reflection of that. We're off, we've actually gone beyond our time. So though I would have liked to have had both your responses on a couple of more questions. There are students who've written in about how they are conflicted by ideologies and information that architecture sort of throws at them. We'll have to take that on further, and I suppose the answer that both of you are giving is that the answer lies in evaluating and actually working yourself, having experience with your own hands in the discipline of architecture, and part of that experience means drawing on knowledge that exists, exists in the craft sector. So I'd just like to ask you to take, say, a line each, and then we'll have to end because we are beyond our time. And I'll thank both of you.
I think I've spoken the most, especially because of the presentation. So I will not say anything more, but I would like to tell the audience that this is a series which will keep exploring these points. I think so. It'll be good because even if you're ending today, it'll be good if we can all join in next time to discuss further. So I won't say anything. I'd like Srinivas instead to say what he has to say.
Of course, I would like to say in my concluding remark that I still see hope. I'm not of the believer that we can't go back. I don't think we need to go back in that sense of going back, but I think we need to go forward with much more commitment towards valuing and preserving and probably incorporating them in a more sensible and in a more contemporary manner in our day-to-day lives. But unfortunately, so that's how we need to look at it. But I would just like to conclude that maybe educational institutes in this country need to take a look at this, need to sit up now and re-strategize the way they would like to impart education and knowledge and not just impart information.
Thank you. That's a very relevant point. And we will be continuing the series in September. We're in the next session is scheduled about the second week of September, and we'll hope to take on the ideas further and continue to seek answers. So thank you very much, Snehanshu and Srinivas and everybody who's attended and participated in this session.
Thank you.
Thank you to the IIC for organizing this. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Namaskar.